Hello everybody and welcome to another video here on the channel where if you are paying attention, the tone's gonna be a bit different. I'm well aware of what I am here on the YouTube platform. I am a goober who talks about fantasy and science fiction. I'm an entertainer who just happens to be passionate about these genres. But I also have a background in debate and rhetoric, and I want to use that today to counter the ideas that fantasy and science fiction somehow aren't real literature, because this is still something I encounter all the time, not only from ridiculous articles, but from comments or messages from fans who are parents are taking away their fantasy books or not letting them read them because they don't think they're actually adding anything, which is demonstrably false, or even full-grown adults whose coworkers or spouses or children don't respect the fact that they have a deep, passionate love for these genres. And I'm not saying you have to like them. What I am saying is it is absurd, ignorant, and displaying a lack of critical thinking skills to for some reason say fantasy and science fiction do not have any literary merit. And let's break down these arguments and just shred them to pieces the best we can. Because if you tell me you think fantasy or science fiction has no value in terms of like high literature, you're telling me three things. One, you have poor literary comprehension skills, or two, you have not read much fantasy or science fiction, and three, you buy into the definition of genre that publishers have put forth to make more money in the last century without questioning it at all. And let's get into that last point first, because this is really interesting. Publishers control what we think of as genre. Usually they see the new genres that are forming and quickly label them or shuffle them into existing genres as quickly as they can to market and sell them. Fantasy is in an interesting position in this case, because fantasy is often picked through by publishers who will take certain works and throw them into other categories so that you don't think of them as fantasy, and then those works are far more likely to be praised by these people despite them definitely still being fantasy. A very clear example of this is William Shakespeare. Read Midsummer's Night Dream. Are your literary comprehension skills lacking the point where you can't pick out the magic fairies and, creatures that don't actually exist? There's Hamlet and Macbeth also having fantasy elements. He's writing fantasy, and the fantasy elements within those stories allowed him to tell the stories he wanted to tell and have a broader, greater examination of the themes he was exploring. Having fantasy within the pages does not detract at all. We've just seen publishers start picking and choosing what they call fantasy and often removing many things that are really great because they have fantasy elements. And you're going to say, no, they're not great because they have fantasy. Yes, they are. They wouldn't be able to do what they do without them. Well, okay, but those aren't like hardcore fantasy. Let me dismiss both of those counter arguments with just one example. The Lord of the Rings, the series that has set the tone for the better part of a century for what fantasy is in the Western sense of the genre, and what you are marketed to as what fantasy is, because publishers still just look at that for their clear label of fantasy. Well, one, if you read Lord of the Rings and you didn't pick up on a lot of the brilliant, deeper themes, again, please work on your literary comprehension skills. People read those books and they go, it just ended all happy, a little fairy tale. What? Do you think The Lord of the Rings ended 100% happily? No, it did not. It's a meditation from Tolkien directly, and he has stated this about how human beings are losing their connection to nature, the death of our soul in that sense. And that's the actual ending to Lord of the Rings. Magic's dying. That's the point. And if you missed that, that's on you. And I also think more likely than not, you just watched the movies and assumed you knew what Lord of the Rings was. No, you watched the diet version, which is still some of the best cinema of all time. But hey, let's actually go through what the Lord of the Rings does. Tolkien fought in World War I, and his experiences there shaped his mentality coming into writing Lord of the Rings. It's not a direct allegory. He is very fervent that it's not, and it's not meant to be taken as such. There are parallels, for sure, to his experiences and outlook formed from there, but it is a wider meditation on how through the industrial age, human beings are losing our connection to our natural self. And he was right. And to dismiss this part of Lord of the Rings, of course you're devaluing it. You're literally taking away the wider point. That's insanity. And I am dead ass serious when I say I have heard people make the counter argument that why did Tolkien have to write it within Middle Earth and instead not just write it on Earth so we could have a better grounded understanding of what he was going for? The answer to that is obvious. He's using the fantastical lens to go above and beyond what the real story could provide. He takes an entire world to emphasize the ideas and thoughts and go further. That's the point. That's what fantasy allows. It's a greater, deeper exploration. The fall of the elves, the death of dwarves, how the hobbits go away. It's something that hasn't happened in reality, but as a creative, you can go beyond through fantasy. It detracts nothing, it expands horizons. If you look at how we have progressed as a species since World War I and the release of Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he kind of just called it. We have become more detached, more technologically dependent. There is that part of ourself that is being stripped away. And he has a wonderful, sad story that's framed in a way where, sure, if you do no deeper thinking or contextual thinking, I guess, yeah, it's fair to say it's pretty shallow, but that's on you. Something I will never be able to fully wrap my head around is how people can actually look at what Tolkien wrote, a meditation on World War I and the cost of war, what the industrialization is costing us as humanity. And if we simply reskinned Lord of the Rings to take place on Earth and just remove the fantasy elements but told the exact same story, they would absolutely say it has more value, even though you've actually changed none of the content that matters. Yes, dragons, elves, dwarves, they are cool, but they're just flashy things added in to allow for that deeper exploration I mentioned. If you are saying adding those things is somehow making it not have value, all you are saying is you care about the packaging and the way it is presented rather than what's actually inside. You're not valuing content, you're valuing packaging. Okay, Daniel, you chose one of the critical greatest fantasy series of all time. There's nothing from the Poppy War. The Poppy War does largely the same thing. It's taking inspiration from real-world historical context, and then the author is using the magical overlays to bring the characters to an extreme to more rapidly and succinctly examine how someone's mental state can be destroyed by extreme circumstances and then create a Stalin, a Mao. That's the point. The magic is actually utilized by the author to serve a purpose to more rapidly deconstruct and break down a character and examine how a monster can be made. That's what fantasy can add, and that's going to be a nice segue into my next point. Adding fantastical elements does not detract. Unless you, personally you, this is not a problem with the genre, it's a problem with you. If you cannot connect to a work because it has a fantastical element, that's on you. Nothing has been detracted from the story. If I took, I don't know, what's something literary snobs like? The Great Gatsby, and just added a magical thing. Does that detract from the story in any way, shape, or form? Suddenly Gatsby can just spark flames out of his hand for a second. Does that do anything? Did it take no. Nothing's detracted. All I've done is just put in a fantasy element. It's not serving any purpose, but it's just there. But what you can do, and what many of the great minds of the genre have mastered, is using these elements that can then greater explore, go beyond what you can tell in a grounded story that's more real to life, and push ideas. That's the real purpose of a fantasy genre. Allow our imagination, our thoughts to be taken to an 11, to a 12, to a 13, beyond what not having these fantasy elements can allow. And some people are going to say, okay, you've chosen some of the best of the genre, right? Well, that's fine, but look at all these fantasy stories that are not very good. Okay, fine. Look at all these not fantasy stories that are not very good. Yeah, I'm picking some of the best, but I would say even average fantasy is smart enough to utilize these angles. And if you're gonna point at poor versions of fantasy, I'll just point at poor things from other genres and go, yeah, okay, that was bad. You didn't help the conversation here at all, but all right. And the next thing that I see all the freaking time is people not actually having read any fantasy, let alone the best of fantasy, and saying these things. You want proof? Here's an article in The Guardian. Let's look at how this article starts. Titled, "Get Real. Terry Pratchett is not a literary genius. It does not matter to me if Terry Pratchett's final novel is a worthy epitaph or not, or if he wanted it to be pulped by a steamroller. I have never read a single one of his books, and I never plan to. Life's too short." You just admitted you haven't read him! What? Shut up! We would be justified in just not continuing this article at all because the person is just proudly saying, I have this opinion based off of no evidence. Okay, then I'm not going to read your article if you don't bother to read the author before speaking on them. But all right, let's give you one more shot. No offense, but Pratchett is so low on my list of books to read before I die that I'd have to live a million years before getting around to him. I did flick through a book by him in a shop to see what the fuss is about, but the prose seem very ordinary. You are demonstrating to me so confidently that you don't even understand how to value prose. Because there are some things to prose you can pick up upon just a cursory skim through. But in terms of the immersion of the writing and the intelligence of how the author is going to lull you into their craft through so many small choices they make throughout the entire novel, you can't get. The value of prose comes from the complete picture, not just tiny sentences you pick up as you skim through it in a bookstore, you pretentious calm down. I want to be serious. I want to be serious in this video. All right. This writer then goes on to fillet themselves for reading some Jane Austen, which is fine. Everyone needs to read some Jane Austen. I'm glad you finally did. But they then have these weird points around how it's strange that there was such an outcrying for when Terry Pratchett died. Of course, if they'd actually read Terry Pratchett, they know he has a large connection to death through those writing. That makes sense why so many people would be so touched by his passing when he's spent an entire career talking about death. But maybe that's the value of reading something before you open your mouth. But then to go on and call Terry Pratchett's writing trash without having read it. It's like this article's just trying to be as offensive and explosive as possible and exploiting the cultural phenomenon of fantasy being looked down upon to hopefully spark a debate they know already exists online, which is exactly what this person did, and I'm going to exploit it to show how silly these arguments can be. But Terry Pratchett? Get real. It's time we stop this pretense that mediocrity is equal to genius. Again, this person is saying this after admitting having never read him. And let's talk about Pratchett, a man who personified death so well. People on their deathbeds wrote him saying they hope death actually is like how we penned it, because death in Discworld is so thoughtful, philosophical, relatable. It's beautiful. And his ability to use absurdism to explore the human condition, our own flaws, and the greatness within humanity, I would argue was unrivaled in literature. But no, this person completely and utterly dismisses the idea of valuing Terry Pratchett as a genius based off of his kind of skimming for a bit in a bookstore that one time. That's like watching the trailer for 2001 Space Odyssey and going, ah. No, it's not even like the trailer. It's like looking at the YouTube thumbnail of the trailer. That article is just someone patting themselves in the back for having read some other authors. Completely irrelevant to a discussion about Terry Pratchett. And that's the consistent pattern I see with people who do this. They buy into the publisher's definition of genre without thinking beyond what they're being just blanket told by these corporations who want to sell them as best they can. And then they never actually bother to look deeper into material. And then they'll argue that somehow something is taken away by adding in fantasy elements without providing any evidence of why that thought is true. We have His Dark Materials being a beautiful critique of organized religions. We have C.S. Lewis advocating for Christian ideas through the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien is tearing apart our trajectory as humankind. And I have not even touched on the value of science fiction, a genre that has actually inspired real technology countless times. A genre that at its core is about the possibilities of humanity. Where could we go? Or the ideas that are beyond our comprehension now, attempting to be framed in a way where we can understand them. Addressing the existential dread that becomes more prevalent within our culture as we understand the universe around us to a greater extent. The likes of Asimov or Octavia Butler have gone far beyond what anyone who would dismiss their work will ever actually contribute to the world. Asimov inspired real-world inventors to create things that now you probably use in your daily life. Octavia Butler essentially called many of the problems that are existing in America through her dystopian lens of Parable of the Sower to the point where she actually got campaign slogans right, the class issues that are going on, the corporate corruption, and you're gonna just say, no, there's no value to that. It's not like the authors saw actual societal problems coming and used this one genre to explore it in a very, very amazing, insightful way. No. There's no value there. Because I lack any literary comprehension skills beyond what I think makes me feel good and better about myself. That's what you're saying. And the person you're telling not to read this book, that's probably going to inspire a larger love of reading that will go beyond the fantasy and sci-fi genres and on its own is absolutely worth something, is better than you, more intelligent than you, and certainly, I'm going to assume, on a way to be or currently better read, because they're not dismissing two of the most valuable genres in terms of what the human mind can craft and create because it makes them feel superior. And that's where I'll end this video. I'm ending it a bit more snobby and condescending than I wanted, but sorry, it's just me kind of pushing back on the decades of snobbery I've had to deal with from people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. I've read hundreds, maybe even at this point, 1,000 books in my life, many of them fantasy, sci-fi, many of them not. And I can tell you, as someone who makes a living talking about books, there's not even that much of a difference. I don't even advocate for sci-fi and fantasy to be better. They are just labels. And it's about the author's intent. It's about what the author's accomplishing. And if they put something in there that's supernatural or it's futuristic set, who gives a shit? Value the work based off its execution and how it impacts you, the reader. Just cut the shit out. I'm really tired of it. Bye.